On the night of August 19th, 1953, a crowd of several thousand people moved through the streets of Tehran. They were not a spontaneous demonstration. They had been organized, paid, and directed, some of them by Iranian military officers who were acting on orders from the CIA and MI6, some of them by hired thugs from the Tehran underworld, some of them by religious figures whose networks of influence in the bazaar and the mosque had been activated by American and British agents working through intermediaries. The crowd moved toward the offices of Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh. By the end of the day, Mosaddegh had been arrested, the democratically elected government of Iran had been overthrown, and the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had fled the country 2 days earlier when a first coup attempt had failed, was on his way back from Rome. The operation that produced this outcome was called Operation Ajax by the CIA and Operation Boot by MI6. It was the first peacetime covert operation in CIA history in which a foreign government was overthrown. It was authorized at the highest levels of both the American and British governments by President Eisenhower, who had taken office in January 1953 and who had been convinced by British intelligence and by the Dulles brothers, John Foster at the State Department and Allen at the CIA, that Mossadegh's government was drifting toward communism and toward the Soviet Union. The British motivation was more straightforwardly commercial. Mossadegh had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the company that would become BP, in March 1951, and Britain wanted its oil back. The 1953 coup is the event that explains modern Iran more completely than any other single event. It explains the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which overthrew the Shah that the coup had reinstated and replaced him with the Islamic Republic that Ayatollah Khomeini led. It explains the specific character of Iranian anti-Americanism, the hostility towards the United States that has been the defining feature of Iranian foreign policy since 1979, and that is not simply ideological abstraction, but the product of a specific historical memory, widely shared across Iranian society, of what American power did to Iranian democracy in 1953. It explains the nuclear program, the regional proxy strategy, the consistent Iranian resistance to American diplomatic pressure. All of these are shaped by the specific lesson that Iran drew from 1953, which is that accommodating the United States produces the destruction of your government, and that the only protection against American power is the capacity to make confrontation too costly. What historians get wrong about the 1953 coup is not primarily the facts. Operation Ajax is one of the most thoroughly documented covert operations in American history. Its CIA history was declassified in 2013, and the broad outlines have been known since the New York Times published a partial account in 1954. What they get wrong is the causation. The standard account presents the coup as a Cold War story, as an American intervention motivated primarily by fear of Soviet expansion into Iran, driven by the Truman and Eisenhower administration's containment strategy. The British motivation, the recovery of the Anglo-Iranian oil concession, is acknowledged but treated as secondary, as a British commercial interest that the Americans used as cover for their more strategic Cold War calculation. The documentary record suggests a different relationship between the British and American motivations. The British motivation was primary. The recovery of the oil concession was the specific objective that British intelligence was pursuing, and the Cold War framing was the argument that British diplomats and intelligence officers used to convince a skeptical American government to participate. The Truman administration had refused to support a British organized coup against Mossadegh because American officials, including Acheson at the State Department and Averell Harriman, who had been sent to Tehran to mediate the oil dispute, recognized that Mossadegh was a nationalist rather than a communist, and that American support for a British oil company against an Iranian nationalist would damage American credibility across the developing world. The Eisenhower administration's willingness to support the coup was produced by a specific combination of factors: the new administration's more aggressive approach to containment, the specific persuasive work of the Dulles brothers, who were ideologically committed to rolling back communism, and who were susceptible to British intelligence's framing of Mossadegh as a communist risk, and the specific moment in the Cold War when the Korean War had ended and American attention was turning to other potential flashpoints. The Cold War framing that convinced Eisenhower was not a lie exactly. There were genuine communist sympathizers in the Tudeh Party, which was the Iranian Communist Party that operated in the context of Mossadegh's government, and there were genuine concerns about Soviet expansion into Iran, but it was an exaggeration. A frame that emphasized the communist risk while downplaying the nationalist character of Mossadegh's movement and the legitimate Iranian grievance about the oil concession. Mohammad Mosaddegh is the central figure of this story, and he deserves more careful examination than the standard accounts provide. He was born in 1882 into the Iranian aristocratic class. His mother was a Qajar princess, his father was a senior government official, and he had been educated in France and Switzerland, returning to Iran with a doctorate in law from the University of Neuchâtel. He had been active in Iranian constitutional politics since the Constitutional Revolution of 1906, had served in various government positions, and had been a consistent advocate for constitutional governance, parliamentary supremacy, and Iranian sovereignty, particularly Iranian sovereignty over Iranian natural resources. Mossadegh's position on the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was not a radical position in the context of international oil politics in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The AIOC, which had been founded in 1908 following William Darcy's oil discovery in southwestern Persia, and which the British government had purchased a controlling stake in at Winston Churchill's initiative in 1914, operated on terms that had been set in 1901, and that gave Iran approximately 16% of the company's profits, while leaving the company's accounts opaque and its management entirely in British hands. The terms were dramatically less favorable than those that American oil companies were offering to other Middle Eastern producers in the same period. Aramco had offered Saudi Arabia a 50-50 profit split in 1950, which had become the industry standard. IOC's refusal to offer Iran comparable terms was the specific proximate cause of the nationalization crisis. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was not simply a commercial enterprise. It was an instrument of British imperial power. Its Abadan refinery, the largest in the world at the time of its construction, was a city within a city, with British employees living in a company town with its own schools, hospitals, and clubs from which Iranians were excluded. Iranian workers at the refinery lived in separate and inferior conditions. The company's management structure was entirely British. Its accounting was opaque. Iranian government auditors were denied access to the accounts that would have allowed Iran to verify that it was receiving the royalties it was owed. The company had, since the 1920s, intervened systematically in Iranian domestic politics to protect its interests using its relationships with Iranian politicians, tribal leaders, and clerics to maintain a political environment favorable to its continued operation. The nationalization that Mosaddegh drove through the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, in March 1951, was the culmination of a campaign that had been building for years and that reflected a genuine Iranian national consensus across political and religious lines. The Tudeh party supported it. The National Front, Mossadegh's own coalition, supported it. The clerical establishment, including Ayatollah Kashani, who was one of the most influential religious figures of the period, supported it. Even the Shah, who was deeply reluctant to confront Britain and who was under sustained British pressure to dismiss Mosaddegh, felt unable to oppose the nationalization because its popular support was so broad. The British response to the nationalization was economic and diplomatic warfare. Britain organized an international boycott of Iranian oil, pressuring the major international oil companies not to purchase Iranian oil or to provide technical assistance to the nationalized Iranian National Oil Company. The boycott was effective. Iran's oil revenues dropped dramatically. The nationalized company could not find the international oil expertise to operate the Abadan refinery at full capacity, and the Iranian economy came under severe pressure. Britain also froze Iran's sterling assets, applied diplomatic pressure through the United Nations and the International Court of Justice, and deployed the Royal Navy to the Persian Gulf to prevent any country from loading Iranian oil. The Truman administration's response to the nationalization crisis was initially sympathetic to Iran. American officials understood that Iran had legitimate grievances about the AIOC concession terms, and that the nationalization reflected a genuine nationalist movement rather than a Soviet-inspired conspiracy. Avril Harriman's mediation mission to Tehran in 1951, which produced a near settlement that the British government ultimately rejected because it was unwilling to accept Iranian sovereignty over the oil company, demonstrated that the Americans and the Iranians could find common ground if the British would accept the new reality of Iranian resource sovereignty. The British rejection of the Harriman near settlement was the specific decision that made the subsequent coup more likely. It reflected a fundamental British unwillingness to accept the principle of Iranian sovereignty over Iranian oil, an unwillingness that was not simply commercial, but imperial, rooted in the British self-understanding as a great power that did not accept the right of smaller countries to unilaterally revoke concessions that British companies held. This imperial self-understanding was the specific factor that prevented a negotiated settlement of the AIOC dispute, and that therefore made the covert operation appear necessary to those who wanted to restore British access to Iranian oil. The CIA officer who designed and executed Operation Ajax was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, a Harvard-educated intelligence officer who had been working in the Middle East since the late 1940s. His account of the operation, published in 1979 in a memoir called Counter-Coup, describes the specific mechanics of the coup with a degree of candor that was unusual for CYA memoirs of the period. Roosevelt describes the payments to Iranian military officers, the organization of the street crowds, the coordination with the Shah, and the role of Iranian religious networks in mobilizing opposition to Mosaddegh. The specific mechanics of Operation Ajax reveal the combination of covert action techniques that would become the CIA's standard toolkit for regime change operations in the subsequent decades. The operation involved paying journalists to publish anti-Mossadegh propaganda in the Iranian press, bribing members of the Majlis to withdraw support from Mossadegh's government, activating networks of tribal and religious leaders who could mobilize opposition crowds, and coordinating with Iranian military officers who were willing to arrest Mossadegh and his supporters. The operation also involved the systematic vilification of Mossadegh in the American press, presenting him as a communist sympathizer, a hysteric, and an unstable character who was taking Iran toward chaos and Soviet domination. The propaganda campaign against Mossadegh in the American press is particularly revealing because it is the specific mechanism through which the British framing of the coup as an anti-communist operation rather than an oil recovery operation was transmitted to the American public. Journalists who received briefings from CIA officers and British intelligence reported on Mossadegh through the frame that these briefings provided, producing a portrait of an Iranian crisis in which the primary risk was Soviet expansion rather than British commercial interest. The American public that supported the Eisenhower administration's intervention in Iran did so on the basis of a significantly distorted picture of what was actually happening. The Shah's restoration was not simply the installation of a compliant monarch. It was the beginning of a 26-year reign in which the Shah pursued rapid modernization and economic development while simultaneously maintaining a political system of increasing authoritarianism, in which the secret police, Savak, created and trained by the CIA, suppressed political opposition with methods that included torture and assassination. The specific character of the Shah's regime, the combination of westernization, oil-funded modernization, and brutal political repression, was the specific precondition for the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The oil settlement that followed the coup was the specific commercial outcome that the British had sought and that the coup had been designed to produce. The AIOC concession was replaced by a new consortium arrangement in which AIOC received 40%, 5 American companies received another 40%, and the remaining 20% was divided between Royal Dutch Shell and the Compagnie Française des Pétroles. Iran received 50% of the profits, the 50-50 split that Mossadegh had been asking for, and that Britain had refused to offer. The irony was complete. The coup had been executed to prevent Iran from gaining control of its oil, and the post-coup oil settlement gave Iran the same 50-50 profit share that the nationalization crisis had been fundamentally about. The generation that experienced the 1953 coup, that watched the democratically elected government of Iran overthrown by foreign intelligence services, that saw the Shah restored and the political opposition suppressed, that lived under Savak surveillance and repression for the following 2 decades, was the generation that made the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The specific political character of the revolution, its hostility to both the United States and to liberal democratic institutions, its embrace of an Islamic political framework that rejected the Western models that the Shah had tried to impose, was shaped by the specific experience of what happened when Iran tried to exercise democratic sovereignty in 1953. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who was a mid-level religious figure in 1953 and who became the leader of the revolution, drew from the 1953 experience the lesson that the Iranian political elite drew more generally, that engagement with Western powers produced the destruction of your government, that parliamentary democracy was a system that the United States and Britain were willing to overthrow when it produced outcomes they disliked, and that the only reliable framework for Iranian sovereignty was one that could not be managed or manipulated by Western intelligence services. The Islamic Republic's institutional design, with its concept of the supreme leader, its revolutionary guards, its parallel security structures, was designed specifically to prevent the kind of vulnerable single-leader system that had made Mossadegh's government susceptible to the 1953 coup. The American embassy hostage crisis that followed the 1979 revolution, in which 52 American diplomats and citizens were held hostage by Iranian students for 444 days, was experienced by the American public as an unprovoked act of aggression against innocent Americans. The Iranian experience of it was different. It was the seizure of what Iranian revolutionaries called the den of spies. The American embassy that had organized the 1953 coup, and that they believed was organizing a new coup against the revolution. The revolution's leaders were not wrong that the American embassy had been the headquarters of the 1953 operation. And they were not entirely wrong to fear that American intelligence was working to undermine the revolution. The Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, in which the United States supported Saddam Hussein's Iraq against Iran, providing intelligence, weapons, and diplomatic cover for an Iraqi regime that used chemical weapons against Iranian forces, deepened the Iranian conviction that the United States was implacably hostile to the Islamic Republic and was willing to support any regime, however brutal, that would contain Iranian power. The American support for Saddam against Iran is the specific policy that most clearly demonstrates the continuity between the 1953 coup and the subsequent pattern of American-Iranian relations. A continuity in which American policy consistently prioritized the containment of Iranian power over any engagement with Iranian political development. The Iranian nuclear program, which has been the defining issue in American-Iranian relations since the early 2000s, is also a product of the 1953 experience, though through a more indirect causal chain. The specific Iranian calculation that underlies the nuclear program, that nuclear weapons capability is the only reliable guarantee of regime survival against American power, is a calculation that is shaped by the 1953 memory. A government that watched American covert operations overthrow a democratic government in 1953, that watched American support for the Shah's repression through the 1960s and 1970s, and that watched American support for Saddam's chemical weapons attacks in the 1980s, concluded that the only protection against American power was the deterrent that nuclear weapons capability provides. The specific tragedy of American-Iranian relations since 1953 is that every American action designed to manage Iranian behavior has produced Iranian responses that made the situation more dangerous. The 1953 coup produced the conditions for the 1979 revolution. American support for the Shah produced the Islamic Republic. American support for Saddam produced Iranian determination to develop regional proxy power. American pressure on the nuclear program produced Iranian determination to maintain nuclear capability as a deterrent. The causal chain runs directly from the decisions made in August 1953 to the confrontational relationship that defines American-Iranian relations in the 21st century. The JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, signed in 2015 under Obama, which constrained the Iranian nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief, was the most serious attempt to break this cycle since the revolution. Its collapse under the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign in 2018, and the subsequent Iranian decision to accelerate its nuclear program beyond JCPOA limits, demonstrated how deeply the mistrust generated by 1953 and its consequences had damaged the possibility of sustained diplomatic engagement. Iranian leaders who advocate engagement with the United States are vulnerable to the accusation, potent in Iranian domestic politics, that engagement in 1951 to 1953 produced the 1953 coup, and that engagement now will produce a similar outcome. Mohammad Mosaddegh was tried and convicted of treason by a military court in December 1953. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, which he served, and then placed under house arrest at his country estate in Ahmadabad, where he lived until his death in 1967. He was not permitted to leave the estate or to make public statements. The man who had been the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, who had won a decisive vote of confidence from the Iranian parliament, who had been named Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1951, died under house arrest in his own country as a convicted traitor, convicted by the regime that foreign intelligence services had installed over his government. In Washington, in Langley, in London, nobody who had been involved in Operation Ajax faced any legal or professional consequence for the coup. Kermit Roosevelt continued to work for the CIA and later worked for American oil companies in the Middle East. Allen Dulles continued as CIA director until 1961. John Foster Dulles continued as Secretary of State until his death from cancer in 1959. The operation was considered a success. It had achieved its objectives. The Shah was restored. Iranian oil was back under Western company control, and the immediate communist threat to Iran was eliminated. What the operation had actually produced was a 70-year cycle of American-Iranian antagonism that has cost the United States trillions of dollars in military spending, has produced two of the most significant foreign policy failures in American history, in Iraq in 2003 and Afghanistan in 2001 to 2021, has contributed to the destabilization of the entire Middle East, and has created the specific nuclear proliferation risk that American policymakers have spent the 21st century trying to manage. The cost-benefit analysis of Operation Ajax, the assessment of whether the short-term gain of recovering British oil access was worth the long-term consequences, is in retrospect not difficult to perform. Britain got its oil back. It had it for 22 years, until the Islamic Revolution of 1979 nationalized the oil industry again. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company became British Petroleum. British Petroleum became BP. BP still exists. Mohammad Mosaddegh is buried at his Ahmadabad estate, in a tomb that has become a pilgrimage site for Iranians who regard him as the symbol of what their country could have been. If this story changed the way you think about the relationship between covert operations and long-term strategic consequences, about how short-term tactical successes can produce strategic disasters that outlast everyone who made the original decision, subscribe. Every week we go deep on the specific decisions and the specific consequences that made the world we live in. Drop a comment below on whether you think a different American response to the 1953 oil nationalization crisis could have produced a different Iran. I read everyone. I'll see you in the next one.